Okay, welcome to the second lecture of this very short yet intense course on the philosophy of human rights. Before we move to today's topics, let me a little bit but go over the main points we did yesterday and give you the chance to raise questions that might have become clear in your minds as questions. From when we stopped yesterday up to now. So remember, basically the point of yesterday's lecture was to update you to the contemporary debate in the philosophy of human rights. I have started with pointing out that the foundational question is one of the many questions that you might have from a philosophical perspective about human rights. It's not the only one. So the problem of the foundation of human rights does not exhaust the philosophical question you may raise about human rights, but in my modest opinion is a question that enjoys a sort of logical priority over the other ones. Remember, I told you, while it is possible to remain a little bit uncertain about the exact list of human rights we should have, while having a good foundation of human rights. So we can easily think that we have good philosophical reason to believe that, for example, dignity is the foundation of human rights, and still be uncertain what we should infer from that idea that we have proven as the basis of human rights. While it would be strange to present a strong philosophical argument which shows that this is the appropriate list of human rights, while remaining non-committal or at least silent on the foundation itself. So if you tell me that holiday week pay should not be part of the list of human rights as it is right now, and I ask you why, quite likely sooner or later you have to make a reference to the foundation of human rights that you have in mind to answer my question about whether I want to rule out or include holiday we pay among the list of human rights. So in virtue of this logical priority of the foundational question over other philosophical questions that we may have, I decided in my book and in yesterday's lecture to focus on that one only. I mean, for example, the book I gave it to you as material for this class, the other one, the one edited by Ruth, Liao, and Renzo, is divided in two parts, one of which is devoted to the nature of human rights, which is another philosophical question that you may have. The nature of human rights is about whether human rights are moral rights, political rights, proto-political rights, in the sense that they were born as moral rights in the hope that they would be turned into pieces of legislation, or you may ask whether human rights are exclusively directed to institutions. There is a powerful stream in the philosophical lectures of human rights that argue forcefully for the idea that the addressees of human rights are not you, me as private citizens, but always institutions. So let me give you an example. If you go out of this mini course and you find that your car has been stolen, one could hardly argue that even if there is a human right to private property or to the enjoyment of the material goods that you have, one would have a hard case arguing that is a violation of your human rights. Why? Because presumably the thief is another private individual. So it's a private individual who stole your car. And this is a concern for the law, of course, for the national legislation. It is a crime, but it's not a violation of human rights, according to this orientation. Very different is the case in which it has been a police officer that has confiscated your car because you are a political opponent. So when there are the institutions involved, when the actors are institutional representatives, then human rights come into the scene. So according to this orientation, the addressees of human rights are always institutions or representatives of the institutions. Okay, so that's just to give you an example of questions about the nature of human rights that you may have. That has nothing to do, has nothing to do. That is relatively independent of the question about the foundation we are focusing on. Once again, once you have an answer about the foundational questions, this is presumably going to impact the answer that you might want to have on the question of the nature of human rights, but it is nonetheless an independent question. Okay? So after that, remember I introduced you to the three main orientations in the philosophy of human rights: the instrumental view, the non-instrumental / orthodox view, the practice-based / political view. And let me ask you whether some of the things that we said about each of these three orientations were unclear, whether you want to expand a little bit more on the details of what we said. Otherwise, I'm ready to move to Waldron and Siemens. Okay, good. So I take everything was relatively clear. Okay, so today I try to go a little bit deeper in discussing one of the specific philosophical issues we may have within this foundational debate. And the issue we are focusing on is a rather classical one, that is the relation between the idea of human dignity and the idea of human rights. As I have already anticipated yesterday, Orthodox tend to think that human dignity, depending on the various orientations within the Orthodox school, Orthodox tend to think that dignity is either the only foundation of human rights or a non-dispensable part of the foundation of human rights. So you cannot make sense of human rights, you cannot explain their normativity unless you introduce the idea that human beings are worthy creatures, that they have a dignity. And as I told you, one of the things that I find quite unsatisfactory in the literature as it is today is that very few people attempt to give an account of why we have dignity, try to give an explanation of why that is the case. Today, we are going to see first Jeremy Waldron's treatment of this relation between human dignity and human rights. And it, as if you have read the paper, you might have noticed that Waldron is not very clear on the thesis he likes most, but basically is kind of challenging the traditional way of understanding the relation between human dignity and human rights, in the sense of, you have this overarching idea and you can derive from it, from the content of human dignity, you can derive the various human rights that we usually recognize. His paper is a kind of critical view of the traditional way of understanding this relation. And John Simmons is a reply to Waldron in the sense that while acknowledging some of his points, he tries to make a case in favor of the traditional view that ultimately human rights can be derived from a moral foundation, can and should be derived from a moral deeper layer, and in his particular interpretation, this deeper moral layer is the one provided by natural rights. So we are going to see how this works, but what I'm going to do, what I'm going to propose to you, is to go relatively quick on Jeremy Waldron's paper, highlighting the most difficult parts of the paper, and then stay a little bit closer to Simon's reply, among other things because he replies to Waldron, so by looking at the replies we will have a chance to go back to Waldron, obviously. As I said, this is going to be, of the three, the most difficult of our encounters, so I'll try to do my best to make things clear, but I cannot promise an easy traveling through this material, but we'll do our best. Okay, so quickly on the main point that Jeremy Waldron makes. Okay, so Waldron starts from a point that we have already mentioned yesterday. That is the treatment of human dignity in the basic human rights documents. So nothing that comes from philosophy, but from pieces of, well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not exactly a piece of law, it's a declaration, but the treaties are, to the extent in which they were ratified by various states. So the first move is to see how the official documents, let's call it this way, Universal Declaration, treaties, and so on, suggest the relation between human dignity and the human rights that they spell out in detail. And as I said yesterday, this relationship is quite substantial in the sense that, I read here, we are told in the preamble of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that the rights it contains, quote, derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, by the way, do you know why we had two treaties in the 60s, one about civic and political rights and the other one about socio-economic rights? Does anybody know? Well, let me give you a hint. In the 60s we were fully within the Cold War. So, the civic and political rights were those asserted by the West, the social and economic rights were those asserted by the Eastern Bloc. And in fact, the first of the two treaties was ratified by Western liberal democracies, the other one was ratified by countries belonging to the Soviet bloc. So it is only much later that the ratification got mixed, so to speak, and they were ratified both. I mean, of course, the Cold War ended, so that's why we have two different treaties in the 60s. So back to our point, even the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights proclaims that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. Jeremy Waldron is a legal scholar, so he likes to make textual analysis of pieces of law. He makes a fine and detailed analysis of the nuances, the different nuances that you find in the Universal Declaration, in the treaties. Of course, the strongest claim is in the treaties, this idea of derivation, that you have human dignity and really you can derive from the content of human dignity, human rights. The significance of that is limited in the sense that he's going to argue that it's not necessary to conceive of the relation between human dignity and human rights in the way in which the treaties or the Universal Declaration suggests, as if it were one big important concept from which you can, or as if through an analytical judgment, Kant could say, spell out the content that is not unpacked already in that concept, and arrive to the specific human rights that talk about civic liberties, political liberties, protection from starvation, torture, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and all the things that human rights protect from. So the other thing, always in this legalistic mood that Jeremy Waldron does, is to notice that dignity in the official documents does not appear only in the preambles, so what we just read. So at the very beginning, there is this reference to dignity, but sometimes dignity appears also in each human right that is stated by the various articles. Well, for example, Article 1, every human being is, how does it say? All human beings are equal in dignity and rights. So dignity appears already in Article 1, and there is again a suggestion of the fact that if we are equal in rights, is basically because we are equal in dignity. No? It's one way of reading Article 1. But also in more specific rights, for example, Article 10 here of the International Covenant on civic and political rights, that says all persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. So again, Waldron notices these occurrences of dignity in two very different parts in the official documents, asking himself whether this is consistent. Usually, if you suggest that a concept is the foundation or is all you need in order to derive another concept, you should not make the first concept appear in the second concept, otherwise you give a circular definition. So, you can say a house is a thing human beings live in when they are in their house, because that's a circular definition. And so, Waldron notices that the use by the drafters of the official documents of this notion of dignity is a little bit sloppy, if you want, a little bit inaccurate, but he doesn't suggest that this makes the reference to dignity pointless or completely misled. Okay, so again, this is a part of his paper that is nice because it's a nice legalistic analysis of the documents that we have. It's certainly not the center of his paper, and it's not the center, let alone the center of what we want to focus on today. Okay, we start getting into the meat of what we are after today when he starts suggesting the possibility that, after all, human rights might not be dependent on one concept only. So it could be that certain human rights can and should be derived from the idea of human dignity, but it could also be that other human rights are derived from other ideas, overarching ideas that you might find compelling. Equality, avoidance of pain, things like self-government. This foundational pluralism, as he calls it, reminds us, like, if you remember, a strand in the instrumentalist position. Remember that these people thought we don't have to think of one overarching good that human rights defend, like agency. It could be that there are many different goods that are protected by human rights and therefore have to be identified if you want to give an account of why we have the human rights that the official documents confer on us, give us. In analogy to that pluralistic approach of some instrumentalists, we have here a suggestion that not goods, but more ideas, different ideas, could all play a foundational role for human rights. Does Waldron endorse foundational pluralism? The answer is no, because as you will see, he does believe that human dignity is the overarching, organizing main concept that goes around human rights, that organizes all the different human rights. But he, as we will see in a minute, understands this connection between these overarching ideas and the various human rights that we find, not in the sense of something that you can derive from the overarching idea. I don't know if I'm clear. But it will become clear when we distinguish with Waldron, which is, I think, the best part of his paper, these four different senses in which we could have a foundation. So, he's not a foundational pluralist, because he does believe that human dignity is the central concept of human rights, but he's not a foundationalist like me or other people, like Siemens, because he does not believe that you have to conceive of the logical relation between the concept of human dignity and the various human rights that we find in the documents as if you could logically derive the specific human rights in the documents from that overarching concept. The alternative way of conceiving of this relation that Waldron suggests is something that we will explain in a minute. So, okay. Okay, he talks about this definition of difficulties because, as we said yesterday, human dignity is never defined in the official documents, it's only alluded to. Again, Waldron recognizes this point made by Schachter and McCrudden, but at the same time he thinks this is not that big of a problem. Not only was dignity not defined for the reasons that I've already told you, I mean, once you try to give a definition, there is a high risk that you are going to introduce your comprehensive views in that definitions, and therefore that you are going to be divisive, contrary to the universality of human rights that has to be preserved. So, if you try to explain why dignity, why humans have dignity, it's very likely that you are going to appeal to some metaphysical view, to some moral view, to some religious view, which by itself could be divisive and therefore would present human rights as something that appeals to a part of the world, a part of the human population, but not to others. And that's not ideal because, as I told you yesterday, human rights have this strong aspiration of being a universal normative language. So everybody has to agree about human rights. Otherwise they lose their function. I mean, that's why they play the role that they play in international politics. As I was told yesterday, I mean, if these are to be pieces of legislation with consequences, then consent to. So if there have to be international norms, basically there has to be an argument that says these are not just my norms, but are everybody's norms. Okay, so there are these definitional difficulties, fine. Waldron is not moved too much by it. We don't have an official definition of human dignity, that's fine for the reasons that I've just given to you. But Waldron thinks that doesn't mean that we cannot try to conceive of human dignity or try to use human dignity as the organizing concept that unifies all human rights. So a lack of explicit definition doesn't preclude the possibility of human dignity being that overarching organizing concept that makes all human rights cohere in a unified body. Okay, so next point that Waldron makes is the question of whether we really need a foundation of human rights. And he makes many examples, also taken from natural sciences, of the lack of a necessity of having a foundation for having a body of science, a body of knowledge, a body of laws perform the functions they are meant to perform. So basically, nobody denies today that human rights have come to play the significant role in international politics that we know, despite all the hypocrisy of the governments that we also noticed yesterday. And this has been done without having an official foundation of human rights, right? Human rights live pretty well without a foundation, and I was asked yesterday whether this foundational question that I'm imposing on you is just a preoccupation of philosophers or has some practical significance. I've said that I think it may have some practical significance because having a better idea of where human rights come from could convince few skeptics in the world. It could give us more clarity on which specific rights we have to include in the list of human rights and so on and so forth. But it must be recognized that even in absence of an explicit foundation, human rights have lived pretty well in the last 60 years, and they have, increased their impact on international politics quite independently of the fact that no philosopher or no legal scholar or no what have you has come up with a convincing foundation of their normativity. Again, while suggesting this possibility, Waldron thinks that we should not give up the foundational hope, so to speak. And here comes the most important part of this paper, in my opinion. We have to be very careful when we introduce this idea of a foundation, because by foundation we may mean, like famously with being, as Aristotle taught us, very different things. So he distinguishes 4 different senses in which you may speak of concept alpha being the foundation of concept beta, or a set of concepts that you may call beta. Now, the first one, as you see here, is the most straightforward one. Alpha generated beta. So it's if you think, for example, that human rights were born from natural rights, then you may say that natural rights are the foundation of human rights as a matter of genealogy, right? History or genealogy. And we already said yesterday that we don't want to commit the epistemic fallacy here of, or the genetic fallacy, sorry, of thinking that just because beta was generated by alpha, then the normativity of beta is by itself guaranteed by the normativity of alpha. So, I mean, the intuitive idea here is that it is possible to call a concept the foundation of another concept, in the sense that the second concept was generated by the first one as a matter of history, while at the same time remain skeptical about the possibility that the normativity of the first is transmitted to the normativity of the second. So, in translated into the language of the relation between human dignity and human rights, Waldron points out, it is implausible, he thinks, to suppose that human rights grew out of a discourse of dignity. So, if we take the historical genealogical perspective and we ask ourselves, is dignity the foundation of human rights? Then the answer, Waldron thinks, is no. No, because human rights were not generated by a treaty, a philosophical or legal treaty on human dignity. So it's not that the drafters of the official documents had, a treaty on human dignity on their desk, and they read the treaty and then they generated the list of human rights that we have. So they may have said in the preamble that human dignity was the thing human rights are derived from, but it is certainly the case that when they listed the human rights that we have, they were not taking that list from some pre-existing treatment of human dignity. So the Helsinki Final Act declared in Principle 7 that all human rights and fundamental freedoms derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. This statement should be understood in a philosophical rather than historical sense. As history, it would probably be more correct to say the opposite, namely that the idea of dignity reflects socio-historical conceptions of basic rights and freedoms, not that it generated them. So, Waldron suggests, I am very skeptical about this historical suggestion that he makes, that pretty much the notion of human dignity comes later than the notion of basic rights. I'm skeptical because you find, a lot of good discussion of human dignity in Cicero and in other classical thinkers, way before we start even mentioning the notion of natural rights, basic rights. So as a matter of point in the history of ideas, I have my doubts that really basic rights, what we then would call human rights, come before human dignity. But that's the point he makes. What is important here is just to understand that the historical perspective that we are taking. Now we talk about a foundation in this historical genealogical manner. Now, as I said, it doesn't really matter whether human dignity comes before human rights or human rights come before human dignity when you ask yourself the question whether human rights normativity can be derived from that of human dignity. It could very well be the case that Waldron is right, that human dignity comes as an historical point later than human rights, but at the same time be true that human dignity is the concept from which you can derive the normativity of human rights. So the two issues are fully independent of one another. The historical question is not going to give you the answer to the theoretical question, which is the one we are most interested in. What is the second kind of, let's go back to the four here. The second sense in which the concept alpha can be the foundation of another concept or set of concepts beta is a very sophisticated one that should be familiar to law scholars, if there are any here. Because Waldron presents here the same relation between alpha and beta that that Kelsen imagines between the Grundnorm and the various specific laws that we have in legal bodies. So we no longer have the idea that historically one comes before the other. Rather, we have the idea that the validity of a specific norm depends on the validity of a pre-existing and higher law, which, going up in this progressive movement is going to get you in Kelsen theory to the Grundnorm. Okay? So the fundamental norm of any political body of laws, or any legal body. So here the idea is not so much that the content of beta, so of the specific rights we are talking about, is already included in the content of the concept alpha, from which you say that there is a derivation. It's more the idea that the validity of the prescriptive elements that you find down is justified, is generated by the validity of the higher norm that you find above. So there is no conceptual relation between alpha and beta. It's just the validity of the one that is transferred to the validity of the other. Like, once again, the validity of a specific law within a legal body is guaranteed by the fact that it's generated according to the procedure that is legitimized by the Grundnorm in Kelsen system. Okay, the third kind of third and fourth senses in which we could have a foundation are the most important for our purposes. Because obviously, we already said about the historical senses that, interesting as it may be as a point in the historical ideas, it's not going to give us a solution about the normativity of human rights. And it's clearly the case that the relation between human dignity and human rights is not going to be the same one that we have between the Grundnorm and the specific laws, because intuitively we have to have some conceptual analogy between the idea of human dignity and the human rights that we find. So the relation cannot be just a merely formal one in which the content of human dignity has nothing to do with the content of the specific human rights that we find at the bottom level. Rather, intuitively, we expect to find some conceptual analogy between the grounding and the grounded concepts. So, if we move from the first two to the second two, we enter really into the main points. So, in the most important and most relevant part of Waldron analysis. So, what is the third kind of a foundation? In this case, beta can be derived logically from alpha, either deductively, so really like an analytic judgment, so you unpack the content of a concept and you analytically derive other judgments, or with the help of some empirical premises. So, in the case of human dignity, human rights, you have the major premise in the syllogism that says, well, the major premise is that humans have dignity. The major premise of the generation of each specific human right, for example, could be the dignity of the human beings presupposes or includes the fact that they are free to express their thoughts, or something like that. Unless people are free to express their thoughts, their dignity is not respected. That would be the general premise, the major premise in the syllogism. The minor premise would be the most efficient ways in which in the 21st century people express their thoughts is through the press, or perhaps we should say through social media. The conclusion would be that there is a human right to freedom of the press, or to freedom of having a non-controlled internet, exactly what the Chinese do not have, in fact. So, this is an example of how, from the general concept of human dignity, with the help of some empirical premise, today we have the internet, 60 years ago we didn't, so it didn't make sense that back then to talk about the freedom of the net or something like that. Together with some empirical premise, we find a specific human rights. So human rights to freedom of the press, or to an uncoerced, uncontrolled internet. This is pretty much the way in which traditionally the foundation has been understood. And that's the way in which Orthodox understand the relation between human dignity and human rights. Now, Waldron does not say that this way of understanding the relation between the two concepts is wrong. Rather, he likes to highlight, and this is a great, I think it's a great improvement that he does, that there could be a fourth way of understanding the relation between these two concepts that is not as deductive as the third one. In this case, as he says, alpha throws some indispensable light on beta, or helps in the interpretation of beta. So what does that mean? In what sense alpha can be a foundation of beta by throwing some indispensable light on beta? Well, in this case, more or less, we do not present the relation between human dignity and human rights in the sense that you can really derive the content of human rights by unpacking what you already find in the content of human dignity. Rather, you claim that it's possible to come up with a better understanding of human rights if you conceive of them as loosely related, or in some way connected to the unifying idea of human being. What is the difference? Well, let's imagine that you ask yourself whether, forgive me if I give always the same example, if holiday with pay should or should not be included in the list of human rights. What Waldron is suggesting here is that if you think of the idea of human dignity, no matter how loosely, and even if you don't have an exact definition of the idea of human dignity, if you think of that idea, you are in a better position to answer the question of whether holiday with pay should be or should not be part of the list of human rights. So, I guess that in this case, we frame the questions that we may have with some reference to the idea of human dignity, and through that specific framing, we try to give an answer. So if we think that without holiday with pay, the life of human beings is less than dignified, that there is a loss not just of well-being or happiness or achievement or excellence or stuff like that, but there is a loss of dignity in a life that does not have holiday with pay, then we may think that holiday with pay is to be in the list of human rights. While if we think that miserable and hard as it could be, a life without holiday with pay is not a non-dignified life, then we may think that this human rights that, as you know, is included in the official text should go away. As you can see in this example, we are not asking whether holiday with pay is somehow already included in the notion of human dignity, as if you ask whether the deduction from human dignity to the human right to holiday with pay is valid or not. You use human dignity as an organizing idea, as a general tool for answering questions about human rights that you may have. And ultimately, the foundation that Waldron likes most is this fourth one. So he thinks that human dignity plays precisely this role, and that's the way in which we should understand the relationship. Not in the strong third sense of a logical derivation from it to human rights, but more like an organizing, overarching concept that helps us to have a unified account of each specific right, that helps us in conceiving of human rights. This allows Waldron to, and that's the position that he takes, that allows Waldron to his famous thesis that dignity is not a concept value, but is a status value, is a status concept. Sorry. So what does that mean? That dignity we should stop thinking of dignity as a value that generates all human rights. So there is the value of having a good life, there is the value of having a life in which you express your full potential, there is the value of having a dignified life. That's the central value. From this value we derive, like the third derivation suggests, derive all the human rights that protect this special value. No. According to Waldron, dignity is a status, and by status he simply means a short name, an abbreviation for the list of privileges and entitlements that one has. So, for example, a judge has a status. What is the status of a judge? Well, the judge has the privilege not to be addressed to in an aggressive way in a tribunal. That's a privilege that the judge has, right? So the list of privileges and rights that someone has is its status. A nobleman in European Middle Age was someone who had a list of rights and privileges that other people did not have. That was his or her status. Okay? Waldron says dignity has to be conceived as a status precisely in this case, in this sense, not in the sense that somebody has some of the human beings have this status and others don't. It's a kind of democratized status. Everybody has it. In fact, actually, this theory comes from his former treatment of dignity, rank, and some other thing, a book that came out in 2012, in which his basic idea was human dignity is nothing but the democratization of the high status for individuals that was formerly reserved only to a part of the population. So it's, through this democratization of status, everybody reaches a certain level of protection and is given a certain amount of rights and privileges. So, in saying that dignity is not a value but a status, Waldron is simply suggesting that the relationship should not be conceived as it is traditionally done as one in which you have a higher big value that is capable of generating other normative prescription as expression or protection of that big value, but more modestly as a kind of short name for the numerous privileges and rights that are reserved through the list of human rights. Now, is it a short name in the sense that you could also call it, height, or what other names you could give it? No, of course, he doesn't mean that it's a coincidence that we call this status human dignity, because he thinks that some relation to human dignity is what can be attributed to each, what can explain the existence of each of the human rights that we have in the official documents. So it would not be the same if we call this status X, Y, or Z. The fact that we call this status human dignity suggests a conceptual relation between dignity itself and the specific human rights that we have in the list. But once again, this doesn't need to be conceived as a deductive relation between the higher concept and the lower, more specific ones. Yes?
So, for Waldron, the two last propositions, the third and the fourth, are not necessarily excluded, are they?
Well, that's a very good question that Siemens asks. If you ask me what Waldron thinks about the relation between the third and fourth, whether they are mutually exclusive, I am tempted to answer that he does think of them as exclusive. So, incompatible. Whether you ask if de facto the two foundations are incompatible, I think that Simmons is right in saying that they are not incompatible. So, you can say at the same time that human dignity sheds this indispensable light on human rights because it helps you to understand how human